5 years have been erased from your life, and you can't recall a single moment from that entire period. You don't know where you were, what happened to you, or why you were released instead of disappearing forever. This is not just a story about a disappearance in the mountains. This is a story about a return that shatters every initial hypothesis. A woman stepped into Great Smoky Mountains for a weekend hike. 5 years later, she appeared in a tourist drone footage, emaciated, vacant-eyed, like a figure stripped of any past. What happened to her, and what the 5-year darkness holds, is a mystery that sends chills down the spine. But the most terrifying part of this story is the silence. The silence of buried tunnels, and the silence of the sole survivor. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On October 17, 2015, at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, late fall weather was stable, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-50s degree F, and a light breeze blowing through the changing canopy, creating ideal conditions for outdoor enthusiasts. Trails around Clingman's Dome saw moderate traffic, mostly small groups of hikers or tourists who climbed to the observation point and returned. Thorny Ridge Trail, one of the routes starting from Clingman's Dome toward Andrews Bald, is of moderate difficulty with few sudden elevation changes, suitable for experienced solo hikers with basic skills. Among those present in the area that morning was Amber Whitlow, 27 years old, from Knoxville, who frequently hiked on weekends. According to information Amber shared with her family the night before, her goal was to hike from Clingman's Dome down Thorny Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald, take a break, and snap a few photos, then return the same way before dark to avoid the rapid afternoon temperature drop. At approximately 10:22 a.m., time-stamped photos saved on Amber's phone showed her near the trailhead sign, matching the departure time noted by her family. Over the next 2 hours, trail traffic gradually decreased as less experienced hikers turned back, but according to many hikers who were on the trail that morning, conditions were completely unobstructed for someone with Amber's experience. Based on statements from those confirmed to be near Andrews Bald in the early afternoon, the last recorded sighting of Amber was around 1:14 p.m., when a couple of hikers saw her walking on the gentle downhill section leading from the Bald. They described her moving normally, showing no signs of fatigue, not stopping to check directions, and displaying no indication of injury or distress. This was the final time anyone saw Amber on the trail. From that point until late afternoon, there were no images, calls, messages, or any digital data recording Amber's activity. As the sun began to set and temperatures dropped, her family noticed Amber had not sent any check-in messages, as was her habit when hiking alone. Repeated unanswered calls heightened their concern. Friends living near the park also tried contacting her without success. By evening, when she was several hours past her planned return time, the family began checking various information channels, hoping she might have changed her itinerary or moved into a no-signal area. After numerous unsuccessful attempts to reach her, the family started considering the possibility that Amber had encountered trouble on the trail. Around 9 p.m., with no further information from friends, witnesses from the day, and Amber's phone remaining completely silent, they decided to call Park Dispatch to report her missing. In that call, the family provided details of Amber's planned itinerary, the time of her last known contact, starting point, direction of travel, and basic identifying description, officially shifting the situation from personal concern to an emergency under the jurisdiction of the national park. Immediately after receiving the report, a Level 1 search protocol was activated per standard procedures for hikers who failed to return on schedule in Great Smoky Mountains. The overnight search and rescue team was promptly dispatched to the Clingman's Dome area, where they quickly established a temporary command post at the parking lot to serve as the initial coordination point, receive data from the family, check the remaining vehicles list, and prepare to deploy search teams along the relevant trail. Detailed topographic maps of Thorny Ridge Trail and its side branches were laid out to make a preliminary assessment of the area Amber might have reached after the last witness sighting. Coordinating rangers contacted the visitor control section to determine if anyone had reported hearing cries for help, seeing someone in distress, or observing anything unusual that day, but no clear signals emerged at that point. The SR command focused on delineating the last known point LKP based on the couple's statement providing the 1:14 p.m. timeframe. After pinpointing the specific area where Amber was last seen, the gentle downhill slope from Andrews Bald, the SR team leader decided to deploy two parallel search teams, one ascending from Klingman's Dome along the main trail, the other descending from Andrews Bald to close the distance to the LKP as quickly as possible. As they began sweeping Forney Ridge Trail in standard formation, SR members paid attention to trail surface conditions, soil depressions, and disturbed leaf litter to detect signs of unusual movement. In the initial phase, no personal items were found along the route, no hat, jacket, trekking poles, or anything that might have been dropped in a fall or hurried movement. Though no conclusions could be drawn yet, SR noted this as unusual, since most hiker incidents leave at least one item on the trail, whether accidentally or due to environmental factors. The team continued searching near the LKP, using sweep lighting techniques to check for tracks on the damp ground. Some minor disturbances in the leaf litter were noted, but were insufficient to determine a specific direction of travel. Terrain observations showed no clear side paths leading off the trail in this area, nor any signs that Amber had deliberately left the main route. SR expanded the search radius to match the reasonable distance a typical hiker could cover from 1:14 p.m. until dark, but found no results. The team also checked common rest spots, large tree bases, open rock outcrops, but none showed evidence of Amber having stopped there. All observations led to the same preliminary conclusion: Amber was not within the reasonable travel range of a hiker in the hours following her last sighting. When darkness fell completely, SR returned to the command post to update data and prepare an expanded search plan for the next morning. The end-of-day briefing noted that while no clear accident indicators had been found, Amber's complete absence from both the trail and surrounding area was anomalous and inconsistent with typical missing person patterns, forcing the team to consider a wider range of possibilities in the next phase. On the second morning, SAR implemented an expanded search plan based on the lost person behavior model, incorporating parameters such as age, hiking experience, terrain, and time of disappearance into the algorithm to determine Amber's plausible travel radius from 1:14 p.m. until dark. The area was divided into multiple priority search bands, starting with a 1.6 kilometers radius around the last known point, and gradually extending to lower probability directions. Search teams used compasses, GPS, and topographic maps to divide scanning zones and ensure no forest sections were missed. That same morning, the coordination unit deployed additional thermal imaging drones to detect anomalous heat signatures in steep and dense terrain difficult for ground teams to access. Near midday, one thermal drone detected a small, indistinct heat point close to the flank of Forney Creek Ridge, marked as medium priority due to its low intensity but noticeable difference from the ambient background temperature. A search team was immediately dispatched to the exact coordinates provided by the drone, taking nearly 45 minutes to navigate the narrow, steep slope and dense forest along the creek. Upon arrival, the team found low, damp terrain where the ground retained heat longer than usual, possibly explaining the heat signature, but no evidence that Amber had ever been there. No footprints, items, fabric fibers, or fresh movement signs were detected. The location was noted in the report as an anomaly to revisit if related clues emerged, but at the time, it lacked sufficient strength to redirect the search. Concurrently, the K9 unit was redeployed from the LKP, following the gentle downhill section where Amber was last seen. Initially, the dog picked up a scent, but after only a short distance of a few dozen meters, the trail abruptly weakened and vanished entirely. This caught the investigators' attention, as in typical lost hiker cases, scents usually persist longer and remain relatively consistent. The rapid loss of scent so close to the LKP suggested Amber may have left that spot in a way that prevented the odor from continuing on the ground, such as a sudden elevation change, obstruction by a large barrier, or being removed from the surface. Remaining teams continued sweeping high-probability areas like rock crevices, side paths, and gaps under tree canopies, but overall found no viable indicators of Amber's direction of travel. Based on LPB data, the investigation team concluded that if Amber had wandered off following typical solo hiker behavior, her location should have been within or near the first search band. Yet after 2 days of continuous searching, no signs indicated she had left the trail due to disorientation. Amber's disappearance began showing clear elements inconsistent with standard lost hiker models: no continuing travel path, no footprints leading off the trail, no skid marks or scattered items, and especially the K9, losing the scent almost exactly at her last confirmed position. All these factors led the search team to recognize that the operation had entered a more unpredictable phase, where standard behavioral models no longer applied, simultaneously increasing uncertainty about the cause of Amber's disappearance. On the third day, with no additional signs emerging from searches within the reasonable radius based on lost person behavior, SAR shifted focus to a meticulous crime scene-style examination of the site to determine whether any natural factor could explain Amber's disappearance. Specialized rangers returned to the entire LKP area and expanded checks to adjacent trail sections, concentrating on ground surfaces, leaf litter, loose rocks, and potential slip or fall points. In cases of hikers injured by tripping or sliding off the trail, common signs include displaced leaf strips, elongated skid marks on damp soil, or fresh breaks in vegetation mats. However, inspection along Forney Ridge Trail and edges near the LKP revealed that the dry leaf layer remained in its natural structure, with no long drag marks, no body-shaped compressions. The slope where Amber was last seen was not in a high-risk category. If a fall had occurred, the likelihood of a hiker tumbling far down was very low due to brush, roots, and anchored rocks on both sides that would arrest momentum. Scenarios involving falls into sinkholes or deep crevices were considered, but SAR determined the area around the LKP had no pits or deep fissures large enough to swallow an adult without leaving impact signs. Next, the team evaluated the possibility of an attack by wildlife. The area has black bears and some large mammals, but wildlife attacks on humans typically leave clear signs of violence: claw marks, drag trails, fur clumps, bite wounds, or at least heavy disturbance in vegetation. Yet SAR found none of these. On the ground near the LKP and in expanded check strips, there was no blood, no large animal tracks, no evidence consistent with predatory or defensive behavior. This effectively ruled out an animal attack scenario. After eliminating the two most common accident possibilities, SAR continued examining whether Amber might have deliberately left the trail in a different direction. Some hikers occasionally veer onto side paths or into dense forest to take photos, explore, or shortcut, but such behavior always leaves ground or vegetation disturbances. The team began checking side trails, water-cut gullies, and plausible turn-off points around the LKP. Results showed no new paths or footprints leading into the woods, nor any point indicating Amber had stepped off the trail surface. This reinforced the assessment that she did not voluntarily leave the route. Combined analysis of terrain, vegetation, and movement patterns found no evidence supporting any natural accident scenario. Amber's sudden disappearance on a low-traffic but non-hazardous trail section under good weather conditions, with no signs of fall, disorientation, or animal contact, forced the search team to consider the possibility of external intervention in her movement. Although there was not yet sufficient legal basis or physical evidence to reclassify the case from missing hiker to a criminal file, SAR noted that all data from the first 3 days of searching were inconsistent with ordinary missing person patterns, and the likelihood of a non-natural factor's involvement was rising markedly in internal assessments. Amid 3 days of fruitless searching and the successive elimination of natural accident hypotheses, the SAR coordination group decided to shift focus to reconstructing Amber's full movement timeline on October 17, 2015, using secondary data from others present on Forney Ridge Trail at the same time. The visitor management and SAR units collaborated to review the vehicle list at the Clingmans Dome parking area, cross-reference with questionnaire respondents, and collect photos and videos from hikers willing to provide data. Many morning visitors had taken pictures in the trailhead sign area, pine forest, and slopes near Andrews Bald, and metadata in these images, including timestamps, coordinates, and camera direction, allowed SAR to precisely determine the positions and times when these people passed through areas where Amber appeared. After filtering dozens of files and sorting them chronologically, the analysis team began reconstructing Amber's path through indirect data. Some photos showed a distant figure believed to be Amber based on matching clothing descriptions. A roughly 20-second video captured on the trail just before ascending to Andrews Bald contained a figure identified as highly likely to be Amber, appearing in a time frame consistent with inferences from her phone metadata. When combined with timestamps from tourist photos and family information about Amber's morning messages, the timeline became clearer. 10:22 a.m., Amber at the trailhead, around 11:40 a.m., appearing in a mid-trail section via photos from another hiking group, 12:20, 12:40 p.m. Likely near the observation rest area before Andrews Bald, 1:14 p.m., final confirmed witness mark. All these points aligned with the average pace of an experienced hiker and showed no signs of Amber lingering excessively at any location. Next, SAR requested family assistance to access Amber's cloud backup, automatically sync data from her devices. Among the stored files, the team discovered a waypoint marked using a mapping app on her phone, created around midday. This waypoint was not far from the main trail, but not so offset as to suggest a deliberate detour or voluntary departure from the path. It was most likely just a landscape marker or short rest point, a common habit among hikers. More importantly, however, this waypoint confirmed Amber was still moving toward Andrews Bald, according to plan, with no indication she intentionally changed direction or started a different journey. When the analysis team plotted Amber's waypoint on the map alongside the collected photo and video chain, the timeline matched almost perfectly with the distance a normal hiker would cover under that day's conditions. There were no unusual gaps long enough for Amber to have left the trail voluntarily, no signs of prolonged stops, no evidence she had departed the route before disappearing. The consistency between metadata, witness statements, and estimated travel speed also ruled out fatigue, exhaustion, or disorientation, factors that commonly lead to hikers leaving the trail. Reconstructing the complete timeline reinforced the assessment that Amber disappeared in an extremely narrow time window between her last observed moment and when she should have rejoined the main route. This meant that if any change of direction occurred, it had to happen within a time frame too tight to fit spontaneous hiker behavior. Instead, the timeline suggested the factor behind her disappearance did not stem from personal choice or environmental conditions. From that perspective, SAR concluded that Amber had followed her plan until the very end, showed no signs of voluntarily departing her route, and her disappearance could not be explained by ordinary disorientation or route alteration behavior. Throughout 2016 and 2017, Amber Whitlow's missing person case continued to be handled as an open search, even though the initial major efforts had yielded no results. SAR conducted multiple supplemental search operations seasonally, taking advantage of thinner vegetation in winter and early spring to observe the terrain more clearly, while rechecking steep slopes, rock crevices, stream edges, and areas previously obscured by limited visibility. Despite expanding the search bands farther from the LKP and inspecting many side branches of Forney Ridge Trail, the search team still found no physical evidence, no clothing, no scraps of fabric, no personal gear, and most importantly, no body or decomposition signs consistent with the time missing. The absence of any evidence over such a prolonged period was deemed highly unusual for hiker incidents, which typically leave at least one identifiable sign or result in body recovery within 1 to 2 seasons. In parallel with field searches, the NPS also received reports from tourists, residents near the park boundary, and wilderness groups. Some informal reports of strange noises or nighttime lights were logged, but none directly tied to the area of Amber's disappearance or held investigative value. Additional interviews with individuals who had been on Forney Ridge Trail on October 17, 2015, produced no new information beyond what had already been established in the timeline phase. Around mid-2016, authorities collaborated with independent ELSR experts to conduct a comprehensive case review. The resulting report concluded that this disappearance did not fit any pattern within the lost hiker behavior category. No signs of disorientation, no indications of exhaustion, no data suggesting Amber had voluntarily left the trail, and no sequence consistent with falls or natural environment accidents. Even when simulating less common accident scenarios, such as being pushed by strong winds, sliding into damp crevices, or being covered by rockfalls, the results showed that SAR had already checked all plausible body locations. For the next 2 years, the case remained in monitoring status to receive new information, but community reports, re-examination of tourist cameras, analysis of old phone signals, and reviews of Amber's digital accounts produced no breakthroughs. There was no trace indicating Amber had left the park, nor any data confirming she continued moving after her last sighting. By the end of 2017, after passing every reasonable time frame in which a misadventure, accident, or voluntary trail departure could be plausibly explained, NPS and SAR jointly classified the case as a long-term missing person file. Amber Whitlow's file was officially moved to the Great Smoky Mountains cold case list under identifier GSM 2147, with the notation that the cause of disappearance could not be determined by any known behavioral or natural accident model, and no physical evidence supported any of those hypotheses. This detail placed the case in a particularly rare category in the park's disappearance history, where most incidents had clearer signs or were resolved within months. On November 23, 2020, more than 5 years after Amber Whitlow was reported missing and her file had been listed as cold case GSM 2147, an unexpected event occurred that initially no one thought was connected to the case. A tourist from Ohio, hiking the Ramsey Cascades Trail, an area quite far from Forney Ridge Trail and outside the main SR search zones of previous years, used a drone to capture footage of the waterfall from above. This trail is known for its steep incline and complex terrain, so the tourist's drone footage was primarily intended to record the majestic scenery of the area, not to closely observe details behind the waterfall. After returning home and uploading all the data to his computer, the tourist accidentally noticed a small movement in a roughly 40-second segment of video showing the area behind the water column. Upon review, the movement appeared to be part of a human body, seemingly an arm, attempting to inch outward from within a narrow rock crevice right behind the falling water curtain. Unsure of what it was, and believing that if it was a person, it could indicate someone in danger, he decided to send the full footage to the National Park Service, along with the time and GPS coordinates recorded by the drone. The NPS Initial Data Receipt Unit reviewed the video according to standard procedures for unusual reports. Although the image was blurry due to water and low contrast, the technical team confirmed movement consistent with the shape of a human arm and, more importantly, that the rock crevice location was in a highly inaccessible area, not a place ordinary tourists could enter. This was sufficient to trigger emergency evaluation protocol. A technical climbing team was dispatched the same day, equipped with specialized gear to access the crevices behind the falls, a hazardous task due to strong water flow, slippery surfaces, and confined space. Upon reaching the area shown in the footage, they had to rig fixed lines between 2 natural anchor points to lower personnel near the water's edge and find a safe approach angle. After several minutes of observation through waterproof binoculars, one team member spotted slight movement inside the rock crevice, exactly matching the position in the drone video. Upon getting close enough, they discovered a woman curled tightly against the rock wall, her body severely emaciated, skin pale from lack of light, clothing tattered, and clearly in critical physical decline, but still alive. The technical team immediately initiated rescue protocol, stabilized the victim, and extracted her from the falling water zone to ensure airway safety and body temperature control. When brought to a drier area and exposed to light, the woman could not stand, reacted slowly, but still opened her eyes when called. Initial identification information, age, height, matching features from stored records, immediately led the rescue team to suspect this could be Amber Whitlow, missing since 2015. As soon as the victim was brought to a location suitable for stretcher transport, NPS contacted the investigations unit for identity verification. At the temporary staging point, quick identification photos were taken and compared to the missing person file. Despite severe emaciation, facial features, bone structure, and an old wrist scar matched Amber's records. While the medical team provided first aid and prepared her for helicopter transport to the nearest medical facility, official biometric database verification from NPS confirmed the victim was indeed Amber Whitlow. Notification was sent up the chain of command, and file GSM 2147 was immediately reclassified from cold case, missing to recovered. Active investigation, marking the moment the 2015 disappearance officially transitioned into a criminal investigation phase, with a living survivor recovered under circumstances that could not be explained by any previously recorded facts. After being extracted from the rock crevice at Ramsey Cascades and airlifted to the nearest medical facility, Amber Whitlow was admitted in a state of severe emaciation, prompting the medical team and forensic experts to conduct a comprehensive evaluation to determine the extent of bodily damage and the survival context throughout more than 5 years missing. On initial examination, doctors noted pronounced muscle atrophy in both upper and lower limbs, particularly the quadriceps and calf muscles, groups that typically persist even in minimally active individuals. Amber's body mass index had dropped dramatically compared to her 2015 records, indicating prolonged malnutrition rather than a temporary starvation period. Blood tests revealed extremely low vitamin D levels, a rarity in individuals regularly exposed to natural light. This immediately suggested Amber had lived in a low-light environment, as such severe vitamin D deficiency cannot occur simply from being in the forest or lost outdoors. Instead, it is typically associated with prolonged confinement in enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces. Additionally, Amber's bone structure showed progressive osteoporosis, a condition commonly seen in people with restricted mobility or inability to walk for years, further supporting the assessment that she had not spent 5 years in a natural outdoor environment. Detailed examination of her wrists and ankles revealed circular, deeply grooved scars with surrounding hypertrophic scar tissue, characteristic signs of repeated friction from fixed restraints such as ropes or shackles. Although these scars were old and healed over time, their uniform shape indicated they were not caused by falls, rock impacts, or natural vines. Some scars showed color variations, suggesting formation at different times, meaning this form of restraint was not a single event but occurred over an extended period. Amber also had multiple healed minor bruises and scars on her shins and forearms, non-serious injuries, but bearing characteristics of repeated impacts in a confined space where a restrained person could easily strike walls or hard objects. Rib X-rays revealed 2 misaligned healed fractures, estimated to have occurred 2 to 3 years before recovery. Such improper healing typically accompanies lack of proper medical treatment, another indicator that Amber had no access to health care for a long time. Most notably, there were no signs whatsoever of long-distance travel, climbing, or complex physical activity, directly contradicting earlier search phase hypotheses that Amber might have survived independently in the wilderness after getting lost. In prolonged missing hiker survival cases, the body usually shows survival activity traces, call-used feet, muscle hypertrophy, in certain groups from climbing, insect injuries, sun exposure, causing skin darkening, or ongoing thermoregulatory stress. In contrast, Amber's physical condition reflected prolonged immobility, near-zero light exposure, lack of free movement, and minimal contact with natural elements. These combined signs were consistent with only one context. Amber had been held captive in a confined, dark, and movement-restricted environment for multiple continuous years. Hair and fingernail tests showed markedly disrupted growth cycles, reflecting prolonged and uneven nutrient deprivation. This was not the profile of someone surviving in the wilderness, but of someone whose nutrition was restricted by an individual or controlling mechanism. Skin and soft tissue exams also revealed a complete absence of sunburn or light exposure traces, reinforcing the conclusion of a dark and closed confinement environment. Additionally, Amber's cortisol levels were abnormally elevated, indicating chronic, ongoing stress, a common finding in long-term captivity victims. Another key forensic point was the uniformity of bodily damage across many years. No period suggested adequate nutrition, free movement, or physical recovery, meaning she was not lost and then surviving independently for a time, nor captured and released then recaptured. The bodily data reflected a continuous, uninterrupted captivity sequence. From a scientific perspective, medical forensics affirmed that no natural scenario, including getting lost, self-concealment, deep forest survival, or entrapment, could produce such a consistent injury profile over 5 years. Muscle structure, nutrition, light exposure, shackle scars, bone trauma, and chronic stress indicators all pointed to a single conclusion. Amber was not free, not in the wilderness, and not surviving on her own. She had been continuously confined in an enclosed, narrow, light-deprived environment throughout her entire time missing. This conclusion became a pivotal turning point in the case evaluation, shifting the entire investigative approach from an unresolved missing person file to a high-severity, prolonged captivity case, compelling authorities to re-examine Amber's entire journey from the day she vanished to the day she was found. Once Amber Whitlow's medical condition stabilized to the point of basic communication, the investigative team, together with psychological and forensic specialists, conducted an initial statement-taking session to gather orienting information without inducing deep traumatic recall to avoid triggering distress. What Amber remembered was fragmented and non-chronological, but recurring details across multiple responses formed a clear picture of her captivity environment. According to Amber's description, the space where she was held was a small wooden room, limited in size, just large enough for her to lie down, but not enough to walk more than a few steps. The wooden surfaces around the room were rough, with splintered or scratched pieces she had accidentally bumped into, leaving minor injuries consistent with the scars noted by doctors. The ceiling was low, with very dim light coming from a single source, with a dull yellow hue. This matched the vitamin D deficiency and abnormal visual reflex dullness observed by the medical team. Another critical point was Amber's repeated mention of a distinctive sound, a steady running generator, not overly loud, but constantly present as a fixed background noise, occasionally slowing when fuel was low, then restarting afterward. The tone of the machine led experts to assess it as a small to medium portable generator, typically used for off-grid structures or self-built rooms in areas without fixed electrical supply. In addition to the generator, Amber clearly recalled the sound of dripping water, steady but not forceful, resembling leakage from a rock crevice or an old drainage system. This sound did not vary by season or time of day, suggesting the water source near the confinement location was in stable terrain, not a strong flowing stream or outdoor creek that would show clear volume changes with rainfall. Another particularly important factor was the door locking procedure. Amber described that every time her captor left, he performed a repeated action, pulling the wooden door shut, then making 2 consecutive metallic sounds, likely a latch and a bolt, before walking away. This procedure never changed throughout her captivity, creating an auditory imprint that allowed Amber to recognize when he was approaching or departing. The metal latch locking method indicated the confinement space was not merely a temporary shelter or natural rock hollow, but a man-made structure equipped with secure locks or bolts. When asked about unusual changes in the environment, Amber mentioned an event she called the ceiling collapse. She described a portion of the wooden ceiling shaking violently after a loud sound from above, then breaking and falling into the room, creating an opening large enough for light to enter. Forensic specialists paid particular attention to this detail, because it indicated the structure where Amber was held was not a natural cave, but a reinforced wooden ceiling space, something not found in deep wilderness unless deliberately constructed. After that event, Amber described hearing her captor moving in panic, then not returning, leading to the moment she attempted to escape the confinement space. Beyond auditory and structural elements, Amber also described the surrounding atmosphere: damp air, the smell of old wood and earth, a consistent cold that was not outdoor cold, suggesting a subterranean or semi-subterranean location. There was no light change with time of day, no sounds from large animals, no direct wind noise. When compiling the entire initial statement, the investigative team noted an unusually high level of consistency between Amber's physical condition and the environment she described: an enclosed space, prolonged weak artificial light, wooden structure with metal locking mechanisms, presence of a generator, and steady dripping water sound, all within an area showing signs of structural collapse over time. This combination of details completely ruled out natural shelter or random wilderness survival, while indicating Amber had been held in a man-made underground structure. These descriptions became the first direct victim-provided clues, giving investigators for the first time a concrete shape of the confinement location, clear enough to shift focus from hypothesis to tracing a physical site that could exist within the area of Amber's 2015 disappearance and have a connection to a weak flowing water source. From that point onward, case GSM 2147 was officially reactivated, and the NPS, together with federal investigative teams, moved into the technical analysis phase to assess the feasibility of each detail Amber provided. The first step focused on the most quantifiable element, the generator sound Amber had heard for years, which forensic audio experts compared against small to medium portable generators previously used at temporary construction sites or off-grid areas in forested regions. After extensive comparisons, they narrowed it down to 4-stroke gasoline generators manufactured between the 1980s and 2000s, which produce a steady, slightly muffled running sound with a distinctive tone under low load. Amber's description matched models that were once common in repair projects or makeshift facilities in the woods. This opened the possibility that the confinement site could be linked to an old man-made structure previously used and maintained in the past, rather than a natural rock hollow. This assessment led the investigative team to hypothesize about structures built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the workforce that constructed numerous tunnels, storage sheds, utility stations, and underground passages in the Great Smoky Mountains during the 1930s. Most CCC structures had been abandoned or removed from active inventories, but historical records showed that some lesser documented or buried structures still existed. The team began reviewing archived maps, old CCC worker notes, geological documents, and survey reports compiled over decades. From this, they identified a series of technical tunnels, tool storage passages, semi-subterranean sheds, and ventilation shafts that once existed within a few kilometers of Forney Ridge and Forney Creek. Some tunnels had been sealed after deterioration, but actual locations were not always precisely marked due to terrain changes, landslides, and reforestation. To determine which tunnels could contain a wooden confinement room as Amber described, the team integrated current geological data. They analyzed areas with soft soil bases where sediment could shift easily, points with continuous seepage from springs, and zones with limestone or shale layers prone to forming voids, factors that could lead to the wooden ceiling collapse. Amber recounted, the analysis results indicated that on the flank of Forney Creek Ridge and a stretch extending southeast, at least 6 locations matched the geological conditions suitable for old buried or weakened underground structures. These sites were not directly adjacent to the main trail, but remained within a range that an individual familiar with the terrain or experienced in off-trail movement could access. At the time of reviewing this data, the team re-examined all anomalies recorded in 2015 during SARE's thermal drone operations, particularly the heat anomaly near Forney Creek Ridge on the second day of searching. That anomaly had previously been dismissed because ground teams found no person or items, but its timing aligned with the geological direction, indicating possible subsurface voids. When overlaying the 2015 anomaly with collapse risk zones and the CCC tunnel map, the analysis team noticed intersections at several specific areas. This was particularly noteworthy because thermal drones in early morning conditions can easily detect heat retained in soil or buried rock, a phenomenon that could occur if an overlying soil layer covered a weakened underground chamber. From the cross-referencing results, the suspect range was narrowed to 4 target locations within a 3 kilometers radius of Amber's last known point. After cross-referencing historical construction records, geological data, and elements matching Amber's statement, the suspect list was reduced to 4 specific sites, all meeting 3 key conditions: prior existence of a CCC structure, geological features, allowing for crevices or stable dripping water sounds, and location outside the direct line of sight of initial search efforts. Amber's eventual appearance at Ramsey Cascades, several kilometers away from these sites, further reinforced the hypothesis that she had moved through a hidden spatial system, although the exact connection between the points could not yet be immediately determined. Narrowing from dozens of CCC structures down to a limited number of targets was considered a major breakthrough, allowing the investigation to shift from paper analysis to on-site technical approaches, especially given the rugged terrain and high collapse risk consistent with the wooden ceiling incident Amber described. From there, the investigative team coordinated with an underground structural survey group to deploy ground-penetrating radar at each target location in order to detect subsurface voids. At one site near the flank of Forney Creek Ridge, GPR data quickly revealed a prominent signal, an elongated void beneath approximately 2 meters of soil, with a reflection pattern characteristic of a man-made structure rather than a natural cave, and showing signs of uneven subsidence above, perfectly matching the ceiling collapse detail Amber described in her initial statement. Recognizing this as potentially the most significant area, the technical team established a safe boundary and began controlled excavation layer by layer to prevent collapse. It took nearly half a day to remove the topsoil, and at a depth of about 1.8 meters, rotted wooden planks began to appear, layered horizontally, as part of a broken wooden ceiling. Some beams were splintered, others bent under pressure, indicating downward force had collapsed the structure. As they continued removing sections of wood and soil rock debris, a small chamber gradually emerged under specialized lighting. It was an underground room roughly matching Amber's description, only wide enough for one person to sit or lie down, about 2 meters long and less than 1.5 meters wide. The walls were constructed of rough wood, some panels detached or rotted, with repeated friction marks. The packed dirt floor showed signs of prolonged compression, consistent with long-term human occupancy in a confined space. As soon as safe access was possible, the forensic team began documenting every detail inside the room. Along both side walls, especially near the right corner, they found small metal hooks attached to the rotted beams, and beneath a layer of covering soil was a heavily rusted chain still retaining its basic structure. The wear patterns on the chain matched the scar shapes on Amber's wrists and ankles, indicating this was not random debris, but a long-term restraint device. On one section of the wooden wall, under thick accumulated dust, the team discovered evenly spaced scratches, long rows of vertical marks, grouped in sets of 5, crossed by a horizontal line in a classic day-counting style. The sheer number nearly covered part of the wall, serving as direct evidence of the extended time Amber spent confined there. The scratches varied in depth, showing they were made over multiple periods, aligning with medical findings that she had lived there for years. Near the opposite wall, a large fallen ceiling plank lay tilted, with a lengthwise grain fracture, consistent with Amber's account of the wooden ceiling suddenly dropping after a loud noise. When closely examining the floor near the broken ceiling piece, forensics found a dried blood stain darkened to deep brown, not matching any samples the hospital had taken from Amber post-rescue. The blood sample was carefully collected for DNA analysis, as it could indicate someone else who had been present in the space after the collapse event, or who had maintained the confinement room beforehand. The room's layout also consistently matched Amber's description of prolonged confinement conditions. No windows or natural light sources, only a circular discoloration mark, high on one wall, suspected to be the attachment point for the dull yellow light bulb Amber had mentioned. On the floor, the distribution of soil and depressions indicated she could move only within a very small radius, consistent with the severe muscle atrophy and body mass loss recorded in medical forensics. All these elements confirmed this was not a temporary shelter or an accidental fall site for a hiker. The framed wooden construction, the presence of shackles, the day count scratches, and the light fixture proved this was a deliberately built confinement cell intended for long-term captivity. Combined with the collapsed ceiling and rotted entrance features, the conclusion was that the cell had existed for many years and remained operational at least until the ceiling collapse. The forensic team expanded the survey around the site to locate any exit or ventilation mechanism. They discovered a short connecting tunnel now completely blocked by soil and rock, likely once the captor's access route. Remaining traces in the tunnel, from rotted support posts, long-term compression fractures, to the burial of the exit by debris, showed the structure had been purposefully used over an extended period before deteriorating and collapsing. The fact that the room had no viable escape route at the time, Amber was found directly aligned with her statement that she could only leave after the wooden ceiling collapsed and created the sole opening. When viewed alongside all collected evidence, the restraint chain, day count scratches, collapsed ceiling fragments, enclosed spatial structure, and especially the blood not belonging to Amber, the investigative team reached a firm conclusion that this was a long-term confinement site, systematically maintained and bearing no characteristics of a random shelter. From that point, the site was no longer a hypothesis to verify, but became the physical center of the entire case, forcing the investigation to pivot to the next core question: how Amber was initially brought into this location. Based on the evidence from the underground confinement room, forensic medical findings, and Amber Whitlow's initial statement, the investigative team began reconstructing the crime methodology to precisely recreate how the perpetrator approached, subdued, and held her for more than 5 years. The starting point of this process was the last confirmed sighting of Amber on Forney Ridge Trail at 1:14 p.m. A brief, stable window with no signs of disturbance or dropped items, indicating the perpetrator's approach was swift, discreet, and clearly intentional. The trail context at that time had low traffic, dense forest on both sides provided visual cover, and the gentle slope with no side paths meant the perpetrator had to know the trail well to choose the exact moment when no witnesses were nearby. Based on the canine losing the scent so quickly, the perpetrator likely approached Amber from behind, subdued her in seconds, prevented any outcry, and avoided creating ground disturbance, consistent with the lack of physical signs of struggle. After subduing her, the perpetrator had to transport Amber off the trail via a small path undetected during initial sighter searches, most likely a hidden game trail or concealed entrance covered by vegetation. The existence of old CCC tunnels near Forney Creek Ridge suggested the perpetrator may have used terrain knowledge to lead Amber down a semi-subterranean passage and into an old tunnel structure he had modified. The time from Amber's disappearance to sighter beginning sweeps on the first day was too short to build or significantly alter a structure, meaning the wooden cell must have pre-existed and been carefully prepared by the perpetrator. Inside the cell, the crude wooden construction still showed calculation, dimensions just sufficient to prevent much movement. Sturdy wooden walls with anchor points for shackles and the presence of dull yellow lighting indicated the perpetrator wanted minimal light, enough to keep Amber from total darkness, but not consuming excessive power. The continuous generator Amber heard proved the perpetrator had established a long-term operational system, likely an independent power source. This painted a picture of a purposeful, patient perpetrator with basic technical capability. The door locking cycle Amber described, 2 repeated metallic sounds, indicated manual metal latches and bolts. The consistent repetition of locking every departure reflected strict control habits. The confinement environment showed no signs of frequent structural changes or equipment replacement, suggesting the perpetrator maintained the cell in a fixed long-term pattern. Based on shackle wear distribution and floor depressions, Amber had extremely limited movement range, consistent with complete isolation, separating the victim from light, time, natural environment, and any external signals. This not only produced very low physical exertion, reflected in muscle atrophy, but also made Amber entirely dependent on the perpetrator for food and water. The irregular feeding times Amber recalled in fragmented memory indicated the perpetrator did not follow a fixed schedule but varied it arbitrarily, a classic psychological sign of absolute power imposition in captivity. The absence of sexual assault or extreme physical violence, indicators in forensic exams, suggested the perpetrator's motive was not sexual or direct physical torture. Instead, the prolonged confinement aimed at maintaining the victim in a state of dependency and control, possibly viewing the captivity as a ritualistic or psychologically dominant activity. These elements built a clearer hypothesis. The perpetrator did not seek social interaction with the victim, but only sustained her existence within a pre-designed space. The wooden cell showed meticulous preparation, sturdy enough to last years but not requiring advanced engineering. Amber never hearing vehicles or heavy machinery indicated the perpetrator moved primarily on foot through the forest and likely lived nearby or within old CCC structures. The nature of the captivity, controlled, isolated, and prolonged, placed the perpetrator's MO in a rare but stable behavioral pattern, approaching a victim in a favorable environment, rapid subdual, transport to a hard-to-detect enclosed space, sustaining the victim's life while severing all social and light exposure and using locking mechanisms and independent power to ensure continuous operation. From all these elements, the investigative team could begin to clearly envision the perpetrator's method throughout Amber's disappearance, a secretive multi-year captivity model, with the likelihood that the perpetrator had surveilled the victim beforehand and prepared the entire infrastructure to maintain confinement undetected. Amber Whitlow's escape from the confinement room in 2020, after more than 5 years of captivity, became one of the key points requiring analysis to understand the mechanism that led to the cell's collapse and opened an escape route for her. The investigative team began by cross-referencing weather data for the Great Smoky Mountains throughout October 2020. Meteorological reports showed that in the 2 weeks before Amber appeared at Ramsey Cascades, the Forney Creek Ridge area had experienced a prolonged series of heavy rains, including at least 2 extended periods of intense downpours lasting many hours, resulting in high soil saturation and increased hydraulic pressure on overlying soil layers. For old underground structures, like abandoned 1930s CCC tunnels, prolonged water infiltration often leads to wood rot, soil detachment, and eventual ceiling collapse. Wood samples collected from the cell showed progressively increasing rot over the years, along with overlying soil of low cohesion, containing easily sliding silt components. Combining these factors, the geological team concluded that the heavy October 2020 rainfall sequence directly contributed to the cell ceiling collapse. On-site ceiling fracture signs matched high moisture and pressure from water-saturated soil, while broken wood fragments found in the cell indicated progressive weakening that had continued for years before total failure. When analyzing the collapsed ceiling area and the floor beneath, forensics discovered several small blood stains that had soaked into the soil, located directly under the point where wood had fallen. DNA testing showed this blood did not belong to Amber, and the volume was sufficient to indicate the affected individual, most likely the perpetrator, had been injured at the moment of the tunnel ceiling collapse. This corroborated Amber's statement that she heard a loud noise, panicked movement, and then no further return of the perpetrator. Two possibilities emerged. Either the perpetrator was seriously injured and unable to return to the cell, or he could no longer access it due to the entrance being blocked by soil and rock from a concurrent minor landslide. The blood evidence showed the perpetrator had been standing in or near the cell space when the ceiling collapsed, explaining why the regular unlocking cycle ceased afterward. It was precisely this interruption that created the only opportunity in years for Amber to escape. According to Amber, she noticed environmental changes. The generator sound stopped completely, footsteps no longer appeared, and the cracked wooden ceiling opened a gap, allowing light and air to enter. With the shackles already rusted and possibly weakened over time, combined with displacement from the falling ceiling wood, Amber was able to exploit the situation to free herself from the fixed point, or at least create enough space to withdraw her hand from the shackle. On-site inspection showed the shackle had been pulled hard, and a section of wood where it was attached had been torn from the wall, matching Amber's description of her attempt to escape once she realized the perpetrator was not returning. After freeing herself from the fixed point, Amber moved toward the collapsed ceiling area, which created a large enough opening for her to crawl through. Her ability to pass through the fallen soil and rock could only occur if the soil directly above the tunnel ceiling had been eroded or widened by the collapse force itself. Geological analysis noted signs of soil washout from a nearby water crevice, consistent with the steady dripping sound Amber heard for years. According to the hypothesis, continuous seepage had weakened the overlying soil structure and opened a natural drainage path leading to a lower terrain area. As Amber crawled through the collapse gap, she instinctively followed the water and faint light, using the sound of flowing water for orientation. Terrain map analysis showed that if someone escaped from the underground cell location and moved downslope, following natural water channels, they would enter a system of cascading rock crevices leading toward Ramsey Cascades. This was the most logical route Amber could have inadvertently taken, as the steep terrain would pull her body by gravity and force movement toward lower areas. The drone recorded position of Amber's arm also lay exactly along this natural water path, indicating she moved not primarily by active physical effort, but largely due to flow and terrain guidance. The alignment between the victim's discovery location and the geological features around the confinement room showed that Amber's escape mechanism was a direct consequence of the 2020 tunnel structure collapse, creating an exit that had not existed during more than 5 years of her captivity. The blood stain recovered from beneath the collapsed wooden ceiling position in the underground confinement room was regarded as the first critical piece of evidence with the potential to directly identify the perpetrator. The forensic laboratory prioritized sequencing the DNA from this sample immediately after confirming it did not match Amber Whitlow's profile. The DNA strain remained relatively intact despite years buried under damp soil, thanks to the blood adhering to a rotted wood fragment that was shielded from light and decomposing microorganisms. After extraction and purification to remove soil and wood cellulose contaminants, the complete DNA profile was entered into the Federal Criminal Database, as well as state-level databases that archived employment records or individuals with prior criminal or background checks. The comparison results returned within hours. The DNA from the underground confinement room matched the biometric record of a man named Elias Mercer, born in 1972, who had once registered residence on the northern edge of Great Smoky Mountains, but showed no stable activity after 2008. Old records indicated Mercer had participated in forestry repair crews and worked part-time on a project to restore abandoned CCC structures between 2000 and 2005. The fact that an individual with prior exposure to old tunnels and knowledge of CCC structures appeared in the DNA data from the confinement room caused the investigative team to almost immediately focus on him as the primary suspect. A detailed background check revealed that Mercer had lived a semi-isolated life in a small cabin located in the transition zone between forest and private land, with no steady employment, occasional odd repair jobs, and a livelihood sustained mainly by sporadic labor. From 2008 onward, Mercer's traces in public records thinned dramatically. No updated medical records, no tax filings, no new employment contracts, and a gradual disappearance from all forms of social contact. While this pattern is not unusual for individuals choosing an off-grid lifestyle, it became highly suspicious when combined with the DNA match. Old residency records showed Mercer had lived in an area with a little-known side trail connecting to a dense forest section where forgotten CCC tunnels were scattered. Local inquiries revealed that the cabin Mercer once occupied had fallen into disrepair, been abandoned since around 2016, and had no reported occupants. When the investigative team executed a special search warrant for kidnapping-related offenses at the cabin and surrounding property, they discovered multiple pieces of evidence supporting the hypothesis that Mercer was the perpetrator. Inside the cabin, basic items such as woodworking tools, rusted nails, metal wire segments, and a small concrete sample with structure similar to materials used in old CCC tunnels were found in a tool chest. On a wooden shelf, several old fuel cans bore labels for the type commonly used in small generators, a detail matching Amber's description of the generator sound. Outside the cabin, several hundred meters away, investigators located a narrow path leading into the forest. Not an official trail, but showing signs of long-term human use, flattened grass, compacted soil forming a clear route, and branches cut on both sides to create just enough clearance for one person to pass. This path led toward the area on the flank of Forney Creek Ridge, where the underground confinement room was discovered. The fact that Mercer had a direct travel route from his cabin to near the confinement site further strengthened the suspicion that he had maintained the captivity operation there throughout Amber's disappearance. Additionally, during a thorough search of the cabin, forensics located a small locked metal box containing various personal items not directly linked to Amber, but indicative of a pattern of unlawfully retaining others' belongings, possibly for keepsake or control purposes. Although these items could not yet be tied to any other criminal acts, the collecting tendency suggested Mercer exhibited deviant behavior long before vanishing from mainstream society. Expanded investigation into Mercer's social interactions yielded little additional data. Former neighbors described him as quiet, reclusive, often spending hours alone in the woods, sometimes carrying digging tools or large backpacks. One former witness recalled Mercer once mentioning hidden places in the forest that no one remembers anymore, a comment dismissed as odd at the time, but not alarming. When all the data were combined, matching DNA, history of working with underground structures, isolated lifestyle, cabin proximity to the route leading to the confinement room, repair tools, generator fuel, and Amber's statement, the investigative team concluded that Mercer was the only suspect with the access, preparation, and capability to operate the confinement room for more than 5 years. The nature of the confinement room itself indicated the perpetrator was not someone who frequently relocated or altered residences. It required minimal maintenance, knowledge of wooden construction, and the ability to conceal activity over a long period without detection, all consistent with the profile Mercer had developed. Therefore, after completing legal cross-referencing and behavioral reconstruction, Elias Mercer was formally identified as the primary suspect in the case, with the strongest physical evidence being his DNA found at the site where Amber was held, a location no one had any legitimate reason to enter for decades. After identifying Elias Mercer as the primary suspect, based on the DNA recovered from the underground confinement room, the next step for the investigative team was to determine his current whereabouts. Data around 2020 showed Mercer no longer resided at the old cabin, but indirect survival traces continued to appear sporadically: old boot prints in the nearby forest, scattered ash from recently wind-dispersed small campfires, and modern food packaging found a few hundred meters from the cabin, signs indicating he still lingered in the area but lived covertly, with no community contact. When cross-referenced with the ceiling collapse event, and the blood not belonging to Amber, investigators hypothesized that Mercer may have been injured and unable to re-access the confinement room after the incident, was forced to relocate to another area for self-care or a new shelter. Tracking specialists began sweeping the area around Forney Creek Ridge for signs of an injured person's movement, drag step soil compression, scattered small blood drops, or temporary leaning marks on tree trunks. After 2 days of searching, they located a flattened grass trail extending northeast, about 1 kilometer from the old cabin. Nearby was a makeshift tarp shelter, with several brown blood drops inside and outside that were fresher than the sample from the confinement room. Forensics confirmed this was Mercer's blood, matching his DNA profile. This verified the hypothesis that he had been injured in the tunnel collapse incident and attempted to move away from the area. From this shelter point, the team followed the trail a few hundred meters farther to a shallow rock crevice where signs of a very small fire and recently consumed food wrappers were found. Recognizing that Mercer likely could not have traveled far, the team established a radial containment perimeter and approached from multiple directions. Mercer was located on the 3rd day of the tracking operation, in a severely weakened state, with a serious injury to his left leg consistent with the predicted impact from falling ceiling wood. He was hiding in a low rock recess, showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion. Upon seeing the approaching team, Mercer offered no resistance, likely due to extreme physical weakness, and was taken into custody, following protocol for violent crime suspects. After being read his Miranda rights and receiving immediate first aid to stabilize his condition, he was transported to a holding facility, pending interrogation and further forensic processing. Concurrently with the arrest, expanded search warrants were executed for the old cabin and surrounding areas. Inside the cabin, forensics discovered an old wooden box hidden in the ceiling cavity containing items that provided strong proof of Mercer's operational pattern, an old CCC structure map, marked in red ink at 3 locations, including the exact site where the underground confinement room was found. Time and distance notations indicating he had surveyed the terrain years earlier, and most notably, a small notebook recording confinement room door locking instances using symbols instead of written words. The 2 metallic click cycle Amber described appeared in the notebook as repeated vertical bar. Vertical bar marks grouped by day, matching the day count scratches inside the confinement room. This was regarded as a form of confinement room operations log, noting entries, exits, and access frequency each week. Additionally, the cabin contained tools suitable for tunnel maintenance, wooden mallets, old nail sets, steel wire, a small shovel, and various reinforcement materials, such as unevenly cut wooden planks, all bearing wear patterns and soil dust, consistent with samples collected from the underground confinement room. Another key piece of evidence was a fuel canister of the type used for small generators, matching the sound Amber described. In the backpack Mercer was carrying at the time of arrest, authorities recovered additional items, a photocopied CCC tunnel map, a short metal wire segment, consistent with the shackles found on-site, and a folding knife with clay soil traces from the Forney Creek Ridge area. The fact that Mercer kept these items in his pack while moving suggested he intended to return to the tunnel area or was en route to a new shelter. When all evidence was compared against the crime scene and Amber's statement, the investigative team noted an extremely high degree of correspondence that completely eliminated the possibility of these items appearing coincidentally. Every detail from the map, symbolic log, reinforcement tools, to generator fuel, aligned with the confinement room structure and the victim's description. No piece of evidence contradicted or complicated the case. All pointed to a consistent picture of a lone-acting perpetrator who maintained a secret confinement facility over many years and possessed sufficient knowledge to conceal his activities undetected. Mercer's arrest in an injured state, together with the collected evidence, not only strengthened the legal basis for prosecution, but also completed the full behavioral sequence from the moment Amber disappeared to the moment she was found. After Elias Mercer's arrest and the complete matching of evidence with the underground confinement room scene, The federal investigative team moved into the psychological profile analysis phase to determine his motive and behavioral pattern, thereby finalizing the criminal profile. First, investigators gathered all available data on Mercer spanning nearly 3 decades prior to the offense. Fragmented information from former neighbors, employment records, and residency traces showed that Mercer had lived in prolonged social isolation. From 2008 onward, he had virtually no interaction with the community, no participation in local activities, no close friends or family, and chose a deeply secluded lifestyle far into the forest. The degree of isolation far exceeded typical reclusive living. It bore the characteristics of deliberate social withdrawal, commonly seen in individuals developing distorted or paranoid thought patterns without external correction. When analyzing the symbolic log, confinement room structure, and repeated door-locking habit, criminal psychologists identified in Mercer signs consistent with delusional protective disorder, in which the individual believes that confining others is necessary to protect them from the outside world or to maintain an order only they understand. There was no sexual or financial profit element in Mercer's behavior, as confirmed by forensic examination and scene data. Amber showed no signs of sexual assault, no forced labor, and no asset value to justify such a long-term operation. Mercer had no prior criminal record, no history of direct violence, and no economic motive, 3 factors commonly present in typical abductions, making his conduct even more consistent with a control-based crime rooted in delusional belief. This pattern was reinforced by his maintenance of the confinement room for years without altering the design or upgrading it, keeping it at minimal operational level, as if merely sustaining the sealed state was sufficient to fulfill his psychological goal. The control tendency was evident in his notation of door-locking cycles via repeated symbols, as well as maintaining fixed access schedules to the confinement room. This repetition was not aimed at concealing activity from others, since Mercer had almost no contact with anyone, but at preserving a self-imposed ritual. The ritual had a compulsive psychological quality rather than a practical security function. It allowed the perpetrator to reaffirm his absolute control over the confinement space and over Amber. These signs also appeared in the way the confinement room was constructed: small, enclosed, windowless, weak yellow light, isolated from time and natural environment. From a criminal psychology perspective, this design indicated Mercer's objective was not to inflict pain or punishment, but to keep the victim in a state of minimal existence, not dead, yet without autonomy. This was a ritualistic control strategy in which every element of the confinement room served to reinforce the perpetrator's role within the psychological system he himself created. Mercer's use of an old CCC structure rather than building a new also fit the profile of offenders who prefer to exploit existing setups to minimize external attention. His prior work with old CCC projects explained how he knew how to locate and utilize a sufficiently concealed space to remain undetected for years. Deeper behavioral analysis placed Mercer in the rare category of long-term non-contact confinement offenders, a type infrequently seen in U.S. abduction records. This group is characterized by avoidance of social contact, living detached from community, maintaining absolute private space, developing a belief that they serve a role in preserving order within a narrow domain, and imposing on the victim a pattern of total dependency until an unforeseen event disrupts the system. In this case, that event was the ceiling collapse. In terms of preparatory behavior, the perpetrator had sufficient knowledge to maintain the confinement room for years, but did not prioritize his own escape options, a trait often seen in individuals acting on delusional beliefs without anticipating physical contingencies. This explained why Mercer was injured when the ceiling collapsed. He was standing within the danger zone and had implemented no ceiling reinforcement beyond the already rotted wooden beams. Upon completing the profile, the investigative team classified Mercer as a lone offender with no accomplices, operating based on a long-standing distorted psychological structure. His goal was not to cause pain or exploitation, but to sustain static power, keeping Amber in a timeless, lightless, freedomless state as part of a system of his own making. The repetitive behavior, simple yet persistent calculations, and absolute avoidance of leaving surface trail traces were key factors enabling him to conceal the confinement room for years without detection. This profile aligned consistently with the entire sequence of events, from Amber's disappearance to her rescue, and reinforced the assessment of motive, absolute control stemming from perceptual disorder, not from economic or direct violence objectives. When case GSM 2147 advanced to the federal prosecution phase, the trial of Elias Mercer became the central focus of the entire legal process. Here, prosecutors had to prove not only that Amber Whitlow had been held captive, but also that Mercer was the individual directly responsible for her abduction, for maintaining her captivity for more than 5 years, and for causing her to fall into a state of severe physical decline. The trial opened with the presentation of the forensic timeline, a seamless narrative from Amber's last appearance on Forney Ridge Trail on October 17, 2015, to her discovery at Ramsey Cascades in 2020. Prosecutors described how SAR reconstructed Amber's route, the complete absence of any signs that she had voluntarily left the trail, and the anomalies in behavioral data that progressively eliminated natural accident hypotheses. The timeline then connected to the discovery of the underground confinement room. The tunnel's location aligned with the only feasible direction Amber could have been taken during the window of her disappearance. The old CCC structure lay within the area where Mercer had resided, and the ceiling collapse event coincided precisely with the time Amber escaped and appeared at the drone-recorded position. Each timestamp was supported by independent physical evidence or witness testimony. Once the timeline established the foundation, prosecutors moved to present the crime scene evidence, the strongest element of the entire case. Before the jury, forensic experts sequentially described the rusted shackles found in the confinement room, with wear patterns matching the scars on Amber's wrists and ankles. The day count scratches carved into the wooden wall, corresponding in number to the duration of her disappearance. The collapsed ceiling fragments, showing fractures consistent with the victim's account. And most critically, Mercer's DNA sample recovered at the collapse point, a location Amber could not have reached during her captivity, meaning the DNA could not have been deposited by anyone other than the perpetrator. Prosecutors particularly emphasized the DNA chain of custody. It appeared precisely at the site of Amber's confinement, during the time frame matching the ceiling collapse, with no legitimate or natural reason for Mercer to have been present there. Next came the presentation of the captivity conditions and victim injuries through expert testimony. Forensic physicians described the extent of muscle atrophy, vitamin D deficiency, osteoporosis, chronic malnutrition, shackle scars, and misaligned healed fractures in Amber, all consistent with prolonged confinement in a dark, enclosed, movement-restricted space. Prosecutors pointed out that no natural forest mechanism could produce such a long-term injury profile, no sunlight exposure for years, no physical activity, no skin tanning, no soft tissue changes typical of outdoor survival, and no signs of exposure to natural conditions. This was not the profile of an accident victim. This was the profile of a deliberately confined victim. Once the injuries were established, prosecutors shifted to decoding the motive and continuity of captivity. Drawing on the criminal psychological profile, experts described Mercer as a socially isolated individual who had lived in near total seclusion for nearly 2 decades, with a history of working on CCC structures and the knowledge to locate or reactivate a forgotten underground tunnel. There was no evidence of sexual or financial motive, but ample indicators of a ritualistic control pattern, the repeated door-locking procedure each time he left the room, the weak lighting design, minimal power maintenance, keeping the victim in a state of absolute dependency, and monitoring confinement room activity through personal symbolic notations in a log. All these features supported the argument that the abduction and prolonged captivity were intentional and sustained, not impulsive. The defense, while attempting to argue that Mercer's DNA appeared because he happened to enter an old tunnel, or that Amber may have gotten lost and taken shelter, repeatedly faced strong rebuttals from the prosecution. No evidence showed Amber had ever escaped the room before 2020. No signs indicated the room was used as a natural shelter, and there was no plausible way Mercer could have accidentally left DNA exactly at the ceiling collapse site, a location only the room's operator could access regularly. Defense counsel also failed to explain why Mercer's cabin contained a CCC tunnel map marked precisely at the confinement room location, a symbolic door-locking log matching Amber's statement, and the confinement structure and reinforcement woodworking tools bearing soil traces characteristic of Forney Creek Ridge. The jury was asked to consider one pivotal question: does any reasonable alternative explanation exist other than that Mercer was the person who abducted and held Amber for 5 years? With the consistent chain of physical evidence, injuries confirming long-term captivity, the impossibility of natural circumstances producing the same conditions, and Mercer's DNA appearing at a location only the perpetrator could have occupied, the answer became increasingly clear. Every defense counterargument was refuted by forensic data, leaving their position insufficient to create reasonable doubt. As the trial reached deliberations, the direction of the verdict was nearly set. Mercer was not only placed at the scene, but fully matched the behavioral pattern, motive, and all elements constituting the crime. When the trial moved into the sentencing phase, the jury had been presented with a complete set of physical evidence, forensic analysis, criminal psychology findings, and forensic data chains that directly linked Elias Mercer to the abduction and confinement of Amber Whitlow for more than 5 years. After an unusually brief deliberation period given the large volume of documentation in the case, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered a unanimous verdict. Elias Mercer was found guilty on 4 federal charges, including federal kidnapping with an aggravating factor due to the victim being transported across an area under federal jurisdiction, unlawful confinement, prolonged unlawful confinement, aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury through confinement under extreme conditions, and attempted murder, the charge of intentionally placing the victim's life in danger by abandoning Amber in an environment not capable of sustaining life, particularly in the final period before the confinement room ceiling collapsed. Prosecutors argued before the court that each charge was supported by specific evidence and reinforced by the complete alignment between medical examination and the crime scene. Amber survived only because of an unintended incident beyond the perpetrator's control, not because of any opportunity he provided, and leaving her abandoned in a collapsing tunnel demonstrated absolute disregard for the life safety of the captive, sufficient to constitute the elements of attempted murder. Before sentencing, the federal judge allowed the victim's side and the prosecution to deliver final impact statements regarding the severity of the case. Prosecutors emphasized that although there were no signs of direct violence, such as sexual assault or physical torture, Mercer's sustained pattern of confinement over more than 5 years constituted a different form of violence. Deprivative violence, deprivation of light, deprivation of movement, deprivation of time, deprivation of normal human existence, and ultimately the near-total deprivation of any chance of survival for Amber. Furthermore, the fact that Mercer systematically operated the confinement room and prevented the victim from accessing the outside world for years made him a particularly grave threat to the community. In turn, defense counsel attempted to present several mitigating factors, including Mercer's unstable psychological state, isolated lifestyle, and the possibility that he did not fully appreciate the consequences of his actions. However, the judge stressed that these factors did not diminish the gravity of the crimes Mercer committed, especially given that the confinement behavior was deliberately maintained over many years, with repeated rituals and stable operational mechanisms. Federal courts typically apply very strict standards to long-term abduction cases, particularly when evidence shows the victim survived only due to an external event beyond the perpetrator's control. When delivering the sentence, the judge affirmed that the punishment must reflect not only the personal harm to Amber, but also send a deterrent message against prolonged unlawful confinement crimes. The court sentenced Elias Mercer to life imprisonment without parole, the maximum penalty for the convicted offenses. This verdict ensured that Mercer would never return to the community, completely eliminating the risk of reoffending or harming anyone else. After the sentence was pronounced, defense counsel noted the right to appeal, but offered no clear legal basis at that time, while the prosecutor affirmed that the verdict accurately reflected the investigative record, a tight chain of evidence leaving no room for reasonable doubt. When the judge struck the gavel to conclude sentencing, the case officially moved out of the investigation and prosecution phase into the execution of sentence stage, closing a years-long legal journey to clarify Amber Whitlow's disappearance and establish Elias Mercer's criminal responsibility. However, the conclusion of the case in court did not mean the file's value ended there. From that point onward, Case GSM 2147 was re-examined from a professional perspective as a particularly significant case, requiring comprehensive analysis to extract systemic investigative lessons, beginning with a full review of the entire process from 2015 to 2020 and a reassessment of the pivotal role played by initial anomalies that had previously been downplayed. The drone anomaly recorded during the 2015 search, a heat signature irregularity on Forney Creek Ridge, was initially dismissed because the SR team found no person or trace at the surface location. Yet when re-evaluated during the 2020 case reactivation, that anomaly turned out to lie directly over the area containing the buried CCC tunnel and coincided exactly with the underground confinement room where Amber was held for more than 5 years. This became an important lesson for search and rescue agencies in missing persons cases in complex terrain. Even minor anomalies must be archived, categorized, and periodically reassessed, rather than eliminated immediately when no corresponding surface object is found. This case demonstrated that an unexplained anomaly at the outset can become the key to solving an investigation years later, especially when the matter transitions to cold case status. In addition, the file highlighted a broader issue concerning the CCC tunnel system within Great Smoky Mountains. Although most tunnels were documented in historical records, in reality many small structures, side tunnels, ventilation shafts, and semi-subterranean storage rooms from the 1930s had never been fully surveyed or officially marked. Natural forest deterioration, vegetation overgrowth, and landslides caused many structures to vanish from view for decades. Amber's case proved that a forgotten man-made structure can become an ideal site for undetected criminal activity. This led to professional recommendations. NPS and federal agencies should compile a comprehensive remapping of the CCC tunnel system using GPR and LiDAR to identify remaining underground structures and incorporate them into hazard warning categories for SR operations. Furthermore, the SAR procedures in Case GSM 2147 revealed the need to update on-site assessment methods in the early days of a disappearance. When search teams focused on traditional lost person behavior models, assuming the victim became disoriented, left the trail, or suffered an accident, they paid less attention to the possibility of external actors or the use of man-made structures as confinement sites. For disappearances with no physical evidence and no signs of trail departure, as in Amber's case, experts recommend SAR run 2 parallel tracks, searching according to disorientation behavior models, while simultaneously checking man-made structures within the risk radius. This is especially critical in national parks, with a history of old construction or terrain that easily conceals tunnels. Another lesson came from cold case handling. Before 2020, Amber's file was treated as an unexplained disappearance with no suspicious indicators, resulting in limited periodic reviews. However, the emergence of tourist drone footage, a non-SAR, external information source, completely changed the course of the case. This showed that cold cases need to be reopened on a regular cycle and integrated with additional data sources beyond traditional channels. Terrain photos, satellite imagery, tourist drone footage, hiker GPS device data, and even minor reports from residents living near forest areas. The delay in re-evaluating the 2015 anomaly was a clear lesson about the value of maintaining investigative flexibility. Although the case has now closed with a life sentence for Elias Mercer, many questions remain incompletely answered. One of them is whether Amber was the only victim. Given the prolonged nature of the confinement, investigators have questioned whether Mercer had previously attempted to establish a confinement room or had contact with other potential victims without leaving traces. Some items found in his cabin were unrelated to Amber but could not be traced to their origin. Although no direct evidence proves Mercer had ever held anyone else, professional analysis suggests this possibility cannot be entirely ruled out, especially considering his isolated lifestyle and ability to move through the forest unnoticed. Another open question concerns the potential existence of additional side tunnels or secondary rooms. GPR identified several other subsurface cavities in the region, though none yet show signs of connection to Mercer. However, given the extensive and complex nature of the CCC network, many experts recommend continued surveying to ensure no other locations were used for illicit activity or pose collapse risks to visitors. These questions do not affect the clarity of the verdict, but remain an important part of the professional summary because they relate to the long-term safety of the area and the possibility of blind spots in the management of historical structures. Case GSM 2147 is now regarded as a representative case study of long-term abduction and confinement in mountainous forested terrain, where geographic conditions, forgotten historical structures, and solitary criminal behavior intersect to create a case that is both complex and exceptionally rare. From the initial drone anomaly, forensic data, CCC tunnel structure, to the victim's escape due to a natural incident, every element of the case forms a template for training future investigators, SR analysts, and cold case specialists. It underscores that sometimes the solution to a disappearance lies not on the surface, but deep underground, literally, and only emerges when technology, persistence, and chance converge at the right moment. The story of Amber Whitlow and case GSM 2147 leaves a profound lesson for contemporary American life, especially in an era when more people than ever enjoy outdoor activities such as hiking, camping, and exploring national parks. One striking detail is that Amber vanished right on a popular trail, in broad daylight, in an area with significant visitor traffic, a reminder that even vast natural environments are not entirely and absolutely safe. The perpetrator's sudden approach, by someone intimately familiar with the terrain and able to exploit forgotten CCC structures, shows that any outdoor journey requires additional layers of protection, sharing itineraries with family, carrying positioning devices with SOS capability, and avoiding solo travel in remote areas. In addition, the investigation revealed a noteworthy reality: the 2015 drone anomaly, initially overlooked because nothing was seen at the scene, became the key to unlocking the case 5 years later. This reminds us that in modern life, seemingly minor data can carry enormous significance if properly preserved. For today's American community, where personal devices are increasingly part of every journey, retaining digital traces not only helps preserve memories, but can sometimes save lives or aid investigation. The case also reflects the importance of maintaining connection and regularly reviewing cold cases, because in this story, a tourist casually flying a drone at Ramsey Cascades inadvertently created the sole survival opportunity for Amber. The lesson here is not only for law enforcement, but for the community. Report anything unusual, no matter how small. That proactive step can make the difference between a forgotten file and a person coming home. Thank you for following the entire journey to unravel Amber's disappearance. If this story touched you, please hit subscribe so you don't miss more deeply analyzed cases like this one. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring the real mysteries that have shaped how we understand safety and survival in the modern world.